What is 5G? The Global System for Mobile Communications, or GSMA, is a trade body representing the interests of more than 800 mobile network operators worldwide. Quote, 5G is expected to support significantly faster mobile broadband speeds and heavier data usage than previous generations, while also enabling the full potential of the Internet of Things, also known as the IoT. From autonomous cars and smart cities to the industrial internet and fiber over the air, 5G will be at the heart of the future of communications. 5G is also essential for preserving the future of today's most popular mobile applications, like on-demand video, by ensuring that growing uptake and usage can be sustained. End quote. Some of the benefits of 5G include 1. Enhanced mobile broadband. 2. Ultra-reliable and low-latency communications. 3. Massive machine-type communications, including the ability to support at least 1 million IoT connections per square kilometer, with very long battery life and wide coverage including inside buildings. 4. Fixed wireless access, including the ability to offer fiber-type speeds in both developed and developing markets, using new wider frequency bands, massive multiple input, multiple output, or MIMO, and 3D beamforming technologies. The fastest 5G speeds will also need millimeter wave bands over 24 GHz. End quote. As we observe the image on screen depicting the different 5G macro and small cell infrastructure, let's hear Nicole Bjulsma, founder of the Australian College of Environmental Studies, explain the situation in the electrobiology course manual, part of the only nationally accredited electromagnetic field testing course in Australia. Quote, the Department of Communications deployed the infrastructure in 2019 for the rollout of 5G network in 2020. This involves millions of low-powered mobile base stations or small cell antennas every 50 to 200 meters in high-density populations to ensure adequate coverage. The close proximity of antennas is required because 5G uses high microwave frequencies, which can only travel a small distance and is easily influenced by its surroundings, such as trees that need to be removed. Small cells transmit data via direct focused beams of energy, known as beamforming, to a specific area rather than dissipate the available power over a larger area. This network will use phased arrays, i.e. the cell tower will have an array of thousands of antennas that will have an effective radiated power of up to 100,000 watts, aimed at you and everyone else using a cell phone. In addition, the 5th generation of cell phones will contain dozens of antennas all working together to shoot a beam to the nearest cell tower. These multiple antenna segments are referred to as multiple input, multiple output, or MIMO, which allows information to be transmitted simultaneously. Cells will be fitted to existing infrastructure such as street lights, power lines, tram poles, bus stops, railway stations, advertising panels, and may even be installed inside residential and office buildings. In addition to the small cell antennas, the infrastructure also requires the deployment of 20,000 satellites in the Earth's magnetosphere and ionosphere, and there are concerns this may interfere with the terrestrial radiation or Schumann resonance, which life has evolved upon. End quote. Here we can see the electromagnetic spectrum displayed from static electric to magnetic fields at 0 Hz on the left, up beyond the terahertz range and beyond with X-rays and radioactive sources to the right. Radio frequencies are pictured in the middle, ranging from 3 kHz to 300 GHz. Notice the non-ionizing and ionizing classification along the bottom. It is important to note that ionizing radiation is strongly regulated because it has been commonly accepted by all scientific interests to cause harm. Non-ionizing, however, which radio frequency is categorized as, is believed to be non-harmful according to the old scientific paradigm. Therefore, laws and regulations are much more relaxed, and as you will soon see, extremely inadequate. In 2011, the WHO's International Agency for Research on Cancer determined that scientific evidence is sufficient now to classify radiofrequency radiation as a Group 2B possible human carcinogen. This is the kind of exposure coming from cell and cordless phones, cell towers, Wi-Fi, wireless laptops, electronic baby monitors, and wireless smart utility meters. Many highly respected independent scientists have since then stated that the overwhelming evidence of biological harm warrants a classification of Group 1. It is important to understand the enormous difference between natural sunlight radiation and artificial man-made radiation like that of 5G wireless technology. One set of frequencies are in harmony with life and help guide biology, whilst the other is completely foreign to biology. In nature, we have analog sine waves as opposed to digital, and non-pulsed as opposed to pulsed. Nowhere in nature do digital sine waves exist, and nowhere in our evolutionary journey have we ever coexisted with digital sine waves. AM and FM radio may use non-pulsed digital waves. However, the combination of pulsed and digital frequencies have been used since 2G technology. Never listen to the deceptive lies of industry mouthpieces that compare 5G radiation to sunlight. They are nothing alike. Sunlight plays an integral role in signaling our endocrine system and controlling hormone production through sensors in our eyes and skin, intimately connecting us to the sun. Our circadian rhythm and mental and physical health is deeply connected to sunlight. Such statements are a simplistic and absolutely absurd attempt to mislead the public. So let's quickly cover some of the concerns in regards to privacy. Swiss Reinsurance Company, commonly known as Swiss Re, is a reinsurance company based in Zurich, Switzerland. According to Wikipedia, it is the world's second largest reinsurer, ranked 118th in Forbes 2000 Global Leading Companies 2016. So let's take a look at what these world leaders in risk insurance have to say about 5G wireless technology. Taken from their website, quote, "Traditionally, the Internet of Things, or IoT devices, have poor security features. Cyber exposures are significantly increased with 5G. As attacks become faster and higher in volume, this increases the challenge of defense. There are also worries about privacy issues leading to increased litigation risks, security breaches, and espionage. Interruption and subversion of the 5G platform could trigger catastrophic cumulative damage. The focus is not only on hacking by third parties, but also on potential breaches from inbuilt hard and software backdoors." End quote. The best summary of the privacy issues and attack on our freedoms associated with a wirelessly connected world can be found at the Corbett Report, episode 358, The 5G Dragnet. It's only 20 minutes long and provides an incredible overview, looking at the data collection and surveillance element of the IoT, as well as some of the ideological history behind such levels of control, known as the technocracy. Given the high level of speculation around the capabilities of 5G millimeter wave technology, it is important to mention the possible military applications. Taken from the Non-Lethal Weapons Program of the US Department of Defense official website, quote, "The active denial system generates a focused and very directional millimeter wave radio frequency beam. The ADS, a non-lethal directed energy weapon, projects a very short duration focused beam of millimeter waves at a frequency of 95 GHz. End quote. It is important to note that although the active denial system uses the same frequencies as the proposed 5G technology, such applications would require a significant increase in power density. That said, many researchers will still state that the 5G system is a military weapon rolled out by the commercial sector to avoid public alarm. Viewer discretion is advised to determine the validity of such concerns and whether or not such technology should exist in the hands of all governments worldwide, both present and future. The environmental concerns alone regarding 5G technology deserves their own hour-long presentation. However, we only have time to briefly touch on it here. Bees, Birds, and Mankind: Destroying Nature by Electrosmog is brochure 1 of 6 in a series published by the Competence Initiative for the Protection of Humanity, Environment, and Democracy, a coalition of independent scientists, physicians, and lawyers in Europe. Brochure 1 is authored by Dr. Ulrich Warnke, an internationally renowned bioscientist at Saarland University, specializing in the fields of biomedicine, electron-mental medicine, and electromagnetic field biophysics. Warnke summarizes the findings in the brochure as follows. Quote, "Today, unprecedented exposure levels and intensities of magnetic, electric, and electromagnetic fields from numerous wireless technologies interfere with the natural information system and functioning of humans, animals, and plants. The consequences of this development, which have already been predicted by critics for many decades, cannot be ignored anymore. Bees and other insects vanish. Birds avoid certain places and become disoriented at others. Humans suffer from functional impairments and diseases, and insofar as the latter are hereditary, they will be passed to the next generations as pre-existing defects." End quote. The brochure continues to say, quote, "For many decades, research results showing that the natural electrical and magnetic fields and their variation are a vital precondition for the orientation and navigation of a whole range of animals have been freely available. What has also been known to science for many decades is that we as humans depend on this natural environment for many of our vital functions. Today, however, this natural information and functional system of humans, animals, and plants have been superimposed by an unprecedented dense and energetic mesh of artificial magnetic, electrical, and electromagnetic fields, generated by numerous mobile, radio, and wireless communication technologies." End quote. So exactly how dense is this mesh of electrosmog that Dr. Warnke is referring to? Quoting from Dr. Bandara's 2018 paper, Planetary Electromagnetic Pollution, it is time to assess its impact, published in the prestigious Lancet journal. Quote, "Due to the exponential increase in the use of wireless personal communication devices, for example mobile or cordless phones and Wi-Fi or Bluetooth-enabled devices, and the infrastructure facilitating them, levels of exposure to radiofrequency electromagnetic radiation around the 1 GHz frequency band, which is mostly used for modern wireless communications, have increased from extremely low natural levels by about 10 quintillion times." End quote. That is the number 10 with 18 zeros following. As if these statistics weren't alarming enough, Bandara adds, quote, "Levels will surge considerably again, as technologies like the Internet of Things and 5G add millions more radiofrequency transmitters around us." End quote. So once again, we must be very clear about the role that natural radiation plays in our physiology and planetary ecology. Do not listen to the absurd claims of 5G safety that use comparisons of natural EMF that play a critical role in all life on this planet, with unnatural man-made non-native EMF that is foreign to all life. So let's have a look at some of the major scientific groups that specialize in electromagnetic fields and health and see what they have to say. The National Toxicology Program, or NTP, is the most highly revered research group from within the establishment. Here's what their landmark study on cell phone radiofrequency radiation found. Quote, "The $30 million NTP studies took more than 10 years to complete and are the most comprehensive assessment to date of health effects in animals exposed to radiofrequency radiation, or RFR for short." End quote. The NTP studies found that exposure to high levels of RFR, like that used in 2G and 3G cell phones, was associated with, quote, "a clear evidence of tumors in the hearts of male rats, clear evidence being the most conclusive finding possible, some evidence of tumors in the brains, and some evidence of tumors in the adrenal glands." End quote. So clear evidence of tumors found by government themselves. If that's not damning enough, let's take a look at what independent science is saying. Quote, "The 5G appeal was prepared in 2017 by scientists and doctors who are urgently calling for the EU to halt the rollout of 5G due to serious potential health effects of this new technology. 5G will substantially increase exposure to radiofrequency electromagnetic fields, or RF EMF, on top of the 2G, 3G, 4G, Wi-Fi, etc. for telecommunications already in place. RF EMF has been proven to be harmful for humans and the environment. As of September 2019, 253 scientists and medical doctors have signed the appeal." End quote. So why has the public not been informed about such a large-scale scientific concern? They go on to say, quote, "The 5G appeal notes that with the more extensive use of wireless technologies, no one can avoid exposure, because on top of the increased number of 5G transmitters, even within housing, shops, and in hospitals, according to estimates, 10 to 20 billion connections to refrigerators, washing machines, surveillance cameras, self-driving cars, and buses, etc., will be parts of the Internet of Things." End quote. The Bioinitiative Report is a 1,557-page document reviewing over 2,000 independent scientific research publications, with 24 sections, each of which is edited by a world-leading authority in medicine and science. From Section 24, Key Scientific Evidence and Public Health Policy Recommendations, page 4, quote, "Bioeffects are clearly established and occur at very low levels of exposure to electromagnetic fields and radiofrequency radiation. Bioeffects can occur in the first few minutes at levels associated with cell and cordless phone use. Bioeffects can also occur in just minutes of exposure to mobile phone masts or cell towers, Wi-Fi, and wireless smart utility meters that produce whole-body exposure. Chronic base station level exposures can result in illness." End quote. They go on to say, quote, "Many of these bioeffects can reasonably be expected to result in adverse health effects if the exposures are prolonged or chronic. This is because they interfere with the normal body processes and disrupt homeostasis. prevent the body from healing damaged DNA, produce immune system imbalances, metabolic disruption, and lower resistance to disease across multiple pathways. Essential body processes can eventually be disabled by incessant external stresses from system-wide electrophysiological interferences, and lead to pervasive impairment of metabolic and reproductive functions." End quote. So do you think the 5G and IoT blanket 24 hours a day counts as incessant external stresses? Absolutely. And as for pervasive impairment of metabolic and reproductive functions, we are already seeing this. In May 2015, 190 scientists submitted the International EMF Scientist Appeal addressed to the top leaders of the United Nations, the World Health Organization, and the UN Environment Programme. The appeal urgently calls for a greater health protection in the midst of what has become a historic global phenomenon, the rapid expansion and proliferation of wireless communications and electrical technologies. The possible impact of deployment of these technologies on human health has not yet been thoroughly studied. As of July 2019, 247 scientists have signed the appeal. These scientists have published over 2,000 research papers on electromagnetic fields, on biology or health. Their concern is based on the vast number of studies that reported biological and adverse health effects of non-ionizing EMF far below the current exposure guidelines set by the Federal Communications Commission and other international EMF exposure guideline setting organizations. Their concerns mainly include radiofrequency radiation-emitting devices such as cell and cordless phones, cell towers, Wi-Fi, radio and TV broadcast antennas, smart meters, and baby monitors, as well as extremely low-frequency electromagnetic fields emitted by electronic devices and infrastructures used in the delivery of electricity." End quote. The scientific basis for their collective concern is, quote, "Numerous scientific publications have shown that EMF affects living organisms at levels well below most international and national guidelines. Effects include increased cancer risk, cellular stress, increase in harmful free radicals, genetic damages, structural and functional changes in the reproductive system, learning and memory deficits, neurological disorders, and negative impacts on general well-being in humans." End quote. So levels well below most international and national guidelines is absolutely referring to Australia as we have some of the highest and most dangerous safety standards in the world. The Environmental Health Trust is a great resource with a wealth of information and resources, printable flyers and posters, etc. Taken from their article, Scientific Research on 5G, 4G small cells, wireless radiation and health, quote, "Published peer-reviewed science already indicates that the current wireless technologies of 2G, 3G, and 4G in use today with our cell phones, computers, and wearable tech creates radiofrequency exposures which poses a serious health risk to humans, animals, and the environment. Scientists are cautioning that before rolling out 5G, research on human health effects urgently needs to be done, first to ensure that the public and the environment are protected." End quote. Quote, "More than 1,000 physicians signed the original Freiburg Appeal in 2002, which has been translated into many languages. As many as 36,000 people from all over the world support its warnings about the dangers of radiofrequency radiation. Today, we as physicians and scientists call upon our colleagues and the wider global community, but also on politicians from around the world." End quote. That global community is us, you and I, being called upon to step up and share this valuable information, and to do what is right. They continue on, quote, "Human, animal, and plant life is controlled by naturally occurring electromagnetic fields and signals. With their extremely low to very high frequencies, technical electromagnetic fields can interfere strongly with cell communication and metabolism. Initially, the body's natural healing capacity, in its attempt to maintain homeostasis, will correct imbalances through finely tuned control mechanisms. Prolonged electromagnetic stress, however, may lead to chronic impairment of this important homeostatic response and result in disease." End quote. They go on to say, quote, "Scientific studies repeatedly demonstrate that electromagnetic fields can impair self-regulation and cause adverse biological impacts, including increased permeability of the protective blood-brain barrier, changes in brainwave activity, unbalanced release of neurotransmitters and hormones, especially the increase in stress hormones, immune system impairment, damage to genetic material, and lowered fertility, to name just a few of the well-established examples. Oxidative cell stress, a major cause in many diseases, has been shown to be a central effect mechanism of radiation exposure. End quote. For more information on these and other appeals, resolutions, and declarations released by expert scientific groups, please visit Magda Havas's site at magdahavas.com and view the comprehensive list in her article, International Experts' Perspective on the Health Effects of Electromagnetic Fields and Electromagnetic Radiation. To quote from this article, quote, "Since 1997, there have been at least 37 appeals, resolutions, and declarations from groups of scientists and medical doctors familiar with EMF and EMR research. Why are governments not listening?" An excellent paper looking at many of the aforementioned adverse health effects is Dr. Bandara's Impaired Public Health in the Wireless Age, discussing genotoxic effects, oxidative stress, effects on the immune system and the central nervous system, and brain tumors. Also addressed are the key issues of public exposure and radiofrequency radiation and its regulation, electrohypersensitivity in chronically ill people, and public health in the wireless age, making this a great resource to share widely. So let us get a little more specific with the biological mechanisms for harm. Professor Martin Paul is in direct contact with Stop 5G Perth and has helped us greatly. Professor Emeritus of Biochemistry and Basic Medical Sciences, Martin Paul received his BA degree in physics at Johns Hopkins University with honors, and his PhD degree in biochemistry and genetics at Caltech, two of the top institutions in the world. His PhD training focused on how to determine biological mechanisms. The PhD training and physics have each been central to his groundbreaking recent work on how low-intensity electromagnetic fields impact the cells of our bodies and the many health consequences produced by that mechanism. From his ebook, which can be found for free online, 5G Great Risk to EU, US, and International Health. Quote, "We know that there is a massive literature providing a high level of scientific certainty for each of 8 pathophysiological effects caused by non-thermal microwave frequency EMF exposures. 1. They attack our nervous systems, including our brains, leading to widespread neurological and neuropsychiatric effects and possibly many other effects. This nervous system attack is of great concern. 2. They attack our endocrine, which is hormonal systems. 3. Produce oxidative stress and free radical damage, which have central roles in essentially all chronic diseases. 4. Attack the DNA of our cells, producing single-strand and double-strand breaks in our cellular DNA and oxidized bases in our cellular DNA. These in turn produce cancer and also mutations in germline cells, which produce mutations in future generations. 5. Produce elevated levels of apoptosis, or programmed cell death, events especially important in causing both neurodegenerative diseases and infertility. 6. Lower male and female fertility, lower sex hormones, lower libido, and increased levels of spontaneous abortion, and as already stated, they attack the DNA in sperm cells. 7. Produce excessive intracellular calcium and excessive calcium signaling. So in other words, think of it like your cells all have a cell wall, and along that wall are gates, which can be opened with a key. The keys in this case are very subtle frequencies, signaled during our body's natural process of maintaining homeostasis, and letting in a specific amount of calcium. Artificial EMFs trigger the same influx of calcium, but at much greater levels, causing oxidative stress. And finally, 8. Attack the cells of our bodies to cause cancer. Such attacks are thought to act via 15 different mechanisms during cancer causation." End quote. Referring once again to Bandara's paper, Planetary Electromagnetic Pollution, it is time to assess its impact, with citations supporting Paul's mentioned mechanisms of harm. Quote, "Prevention of tissue heating by radiofrequency electromagnetic radiation is now proven to be ineffective in preventing biochemical and physiological interference. For example, acute non-thermal exposure has been shown to alter human brain metabolism by NIH scientists, electrical activity in the brain, and systemic immune responses. Chronic exposures have been associated with increased oxidative stress and DNA damage and cancer risk. Laboratory studies, including large rodent studies by the US National Toxicology Program and the Ramazzini Institute of Italy, confirm these biological health effects in vivo." From one of Martin Paul's published papers, quote, Microwave frequency electromagnetic fields produce widespread neuropsychiatric effects, including depression. Microwave EMFs activate voltage-gated calcium channels, or VGCC, concentrated in the brain. VGCC activity causes widespread neuropsychiatric effects in humans, and microwave EMFs cause at least 13 neuropsychiatric effects, including depression in humans. End quote. So how much mental illness do we see throughout today's population? And it is only going to get worse if we do not change direction now. Let's take a look at some studies that focused on the power density of cell towers and how that affects our health. Because it is not all just about frequency, but also the power or wattage at which they are pulsed at. Quote, "The Ramazzini Institute study on base station RF was another large-scale rat study that also found increases in the same heart cancers that the NTP study found. Yet the Ramazzini rats were exposed to much lower levels of RF than the NTP rats. In fact, all the Ramazzini Institute radiation exposures were well below Federal Communication Commission limits, as the study was specifically designed to test the safety of RF limits for cell tower and base stations." End quote. It is important to note that all the exposures used in the Ramazzini study were below the US FCC and therefore Australian limits. These are permissible exposures according to the FCC and ARPANSA. Many people will try to dismiss concerns based on the idea of safe base station power levels. However, we know that this is incorrect, and it is important to set the record straight. Some more evidence of this fact from the Bioinitiative report as follows. Quote, "At least 5 new cell tower studies with base station level RFR at levels ranging from 0.003 microwatts per square centimeter to 0.05 microwatts per square centimeter, published since 2007, report headaches, concentration difficulties, and behavioral problems in children and adolescents, sleep disturbances, headaches, and concentration problems in adults." End quote. It is important to add, this is highly consistent with studies done prior to 2007, but the effect levels are significantly lower. Public safety standards are 1,000 to 10,000 or more times higher than levels commonly reported in mobile phone base station studies to cause bioeffects. Sperm studies are showing DNA damage, impaired sperm quality, mortality, and viability from cell phones on standby mode and wireless laptop use at exposures of 0.00034 microwatts per square centimeter to 0.07 microwatts per square centimeter. Several studies report sperm damage effects at standby mode cell phone emission levels, which are the low nanowatt to picowatt per square centimeter range. Damage is occurring at very low levels, far lower than Australia's and most of the world's safety standards. Therefore, we need to stop and gather ourselves. Another expert in the field of EMF and health is Dr. Dominique Belpeau, a professor of oncology at Paris Descartes University and president of the French Association for Research on Treatment Against Cancer. Author of numerous scientific papers, he is known for his work on links between environmental degradation and the origins of disease. He also heads the European Cancer and Environment Research Institute. Since 2008, Dr. Belpeau's medical team has studied many hundreds of European patients who suffer from electromagnetic intolerance syndrome. Now, this next piece is absolutely critical to understand. Quote, "Electromagnetic fields provoke major effects in the brain. The most important of these is the opening of the blood-brain barrier. This allows mercury, pesticides, and other pollutants to enter the brain, where they cause various neurodegenerative diseases." End quote. Meaning, we are being poisoned synergistically by EMFs and all the other chemicals we were once promised were safe, mercury and glyphosate. Thank you for watching. We have now reached the halfway mark. Please consider taking some time to integrate this information before continuing on. The now past Dr. Martin Blank was an associate professor at the Department of Physiology and Cellular Biophysics at Columbia University College of Physicians and Surgeons. A researcher in bioelectromagnetics, Dr. Blank was the author of the Bioinitiative Reports section on stress proteins, making him a true voice for the cause. He states, quote, "The brain is exposed to radiation from mobile phone antennas, and laboratory studies show that the radiation causes leakage of the protective blood-brain barrier, as well as the death of neurons in the brain. Radiation emitted from base stations can affect those who are in the vicinity. Epidemiological studies have shown a relation between exposure to mobile phones, base stations, and the development of brain tumors. Some epidemiological studies have significant flaws in design, and the risk of brain cancer may be greater than reported in the published results. End quote. With the chronic levels of RF radiation, quote, the Austrian Medical Association has developed a guideline for differential diagnoses and potential treatment of unspecific stress-related health problems associated with electrosmog. End quote. Section 22 of the Bioinitiative Report, Caution in Action, Global Public Health Advice, quotes European Environmental Agency Director Jacqueline McGlade in saying, quote, in our judgment, the human and experimental evidence taken together is clear enough to support using the precautionary principle to justify reducing exposures where feasible, and to review the evidence for existing exposure limits, which, as you know, are based on thermal effects only. End quote. McGlade continues, quote, there are many examples of the failure to use the precautionary principle in the past, which have resulted in serious and often irreversible damage to health and environments. Appropriate precautionary and proportionate actions taken now to avoid plausible and potential serious threats to health from EMF are likely to be seen as prudent and wise from future perspectives. We must remember that precaution is one of the principles of the EU environmental policy. End quote. So what exactly is meant by the precautionary principle, and why are so many experts calling for its implementation? Quote, it relates to an approach to risk management, whereby if there is the possibility that a given policy or action might cause harm to the public or environment, and if there is still no scientific consensus on the issue, the policy or action in question should not be pursued. Once more scientific information becomes available, the situation should be reviewed. End quote. Is the 5G radio frequency issue not the perfect example of using the precautionary principle? Many governments are ignoring it, however, but let's look at who isn't. Lloyd's of London is one of the world's largest insurance companies and acts as a marketplace for primary insurance companies. They are the guys who insure the insurers. As experts in risk management, what is their opinion on the EMF issue? From CFC Underwriting in London, the UK agent for Lloyd's, quote, the electromagnetic field exclusion, known as Exclusion 32, is a general insurance exclusion and is applied across the market as standard. The purpose of the exclusion is to exclude cover for illness caused by continuous long-term non-ionizing radiation exposure, i.e., through mobile phone usage. End quote. These insurance agencies learnt their lesson from over $250 billion worth of asbestos payments and therefore want nothing to do with wireless radiation. Another key scientific statement is the Salatin Statement, led by Professor Ole Johansson, Associate Professor at the Karolinska Institute's Department of Neuroscience in Stockholm, Sweden, said to be a world-leading expert in cell phone radiation. Quote, in November 2009, a scientific panel met in Salatin, Norway, for 3 days of intensive discussion on existing scientific evidence and public health implications of the unprecedented global exposures to artificial electromagnetic fields. End quote. The statement continues, quote, the scientific panel recognizes that the body of evidence on EMF requires a new approach to protection of public health, the growth and development of the fetus, and of children, and argues for strong preventative actions. New biologically based public exposure standards are urgently needed to protect public health worldwide. End quote. Their key findings were, quote, 1. Low-intensity non-thermal bioeffects and adverse health effects are demonstrated at levels significantly below existing exposure standards. 2. ICNIRP, IEEE and FCC public safety limits are inadequate and obsolete with respect to prolonged low-intensity exposures. 3. New biologically based public exposure standards are urgently needed to protect public health worldwide. 4. It is not in the public interest to wait. End quote. So what stands between our health and these known dangers? The following are the key relevant players for us here in Australia. The Australian Radiation Protection and Nuclear Safety Agency, or ARPANSA, creates safety standards taking them directly from ICNIRP below. ICNIRP stands for the International Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection, a non-governmental organisation that has strong ties and loyalty to the wireless industry. ACMA stands for the Australian Communications and Media Authority. They decide on what safety guidelines are to be used here in Australia, relying unquestionably on ARPANSA's guidelines. The WHO stands for the World Health Organization and endorses ICNIRP's and therefore Australia's incredibly flawed standards. The ARPANSA TRS 164 report is the basis of Australia's current safety guidelines. Quote, "We are the Australian Government's primary authority on radiation protection and nuclear safety. We protect the Australian people and the environment from the harmful effects of radiation through understanding risks, best practice regulation, research, policy, services, partnerships, and engaging with the community." End quote. I wonder how many of these so-called experts are happy to engage the other countless experts detailed throughout this presentation. I can tell you it is none, and that should be a red flag. They must rely on never facing open, expert scrutiny to maintain their false narrative. So how do these standards stack up internationally? The following is taken from the Australian College of Environmental Studies summary of the international standards. Australia and the US standards are set at 10 million microwatts per square meter. To put that in perspective, Bulgaria, Italy, India, Israel, France, Poland, and Russia are 100,000. That's 100 times lower than Australia. China is set at 60,000, Switzerland 40,000, and Luxembourg 20,000. The Salzburg Resolution stated a standard of 10,000, with Salzburg adopting an outdoor limit of 10. 10, that is 1 million times lower than here in Australia. Their indoor limit is set at 1. What does this look like in graph form? The discrepancies in public health protection across the world are staggering, with Australia being one of the least protected countries in the world, equal with the US and UK. Other governments are listening and acting, so why not ours? To understand the mess of our inadequate safety guidelines, we need to understand how wireless radiation levels are assessed. For devices held on person, such as mobile phones, the specific absorption rate, or SAR method, was used. Nicole Bijulsma explains the flaws of this method clearly in her must-have book, Healthy Home, Healthy Family, a great resource for understanding and minimizing toxin and chemical exposures in the home. Quote, "It does not assess risk because it ignores the impact of accumulated dose on an individual. This is in stark contrast to ionizing radiation such as X-rays and radioactive sources, which use a precautionary approach. It was developed by measuring the heating effects on a mannequin's plastic head, which ignores a large body of research demonstrating how RFEME acts on cell membranes at non-thermal levels, resulting in irreversible cell changes, DNA strand breaks, and oxidative stress." End quote. In particular, the SAR method uses 6 to 30-minute intervals, or short-term exposure, measuring thermal effects only, while ignoring non-thermal effects. It is important to note that the mannequin head used is based on a top 10% US soldier. How accurately does this represent a child given the enormous discrepancy in size? Which brings us to the last point. Quote, "It is based on adult and not children's exposure. Children have a longer lifespan than adults. Their head shape and size leads to different areas of peak exposure. Their skulls are significantly thinner, and their brain and bone marrow have a higher conductivity to radiofrequency electromagnetic energy compared to adults." End quote. As alluded to, importantly and sadly, no one is left more vulnerable to these flawed standards than children. From Environmental Health Trust, quote, "Children absorb cell phone radiation deeper into their brains than adults. Relative to an adult, children can absorb 2 times the amount of microwave radiation into their brain and 10 times the amount into the bone marrow of their skull." End quote. So back to the Seligson statement regarding the flawed SAR method. Quote, "Specific absorption rate is not an adequate approach to predict many important biological effects in studies that report increased risk of cancer, neurological diseases, impairments to immune function, fertility and reproduction, and neurological functions such as cognition, behavior, performance, mood status, disruption of sleep, increased risk of auto collisions, etc. SAR fails to adequately address known effects from modulation." End quote. The inability of such safety standards to protect against EMF non-thermal effects is made further known by the United States Environmental Protection Agency, with Norbert Henkin from the Center for Science and Risk Assessment's Radiation Protection Division, stating in July 2002, quote, The Federal Communications Commission current exposure guidelines, as well as those of the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers or IEEE and the International Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection, are thermally based and do not apply to chronic, non-thermal exposure situations. The Federal Communications Commission Exposure Guideline is considered protective of effects arising from a thermal mechanism, but not from all possible mechanisms. Therefore, the generalization by many that the guidelines protect human beings from harm by any or all mechanisms is not justified. End quote. It should be obvious by now that the standards we have set in place are absolutely industry-based standards and not health-based. After assessing the flawed SAR ratings for near-field exposure, government and industry came to an agreement on far-field exposure rates, that of radio frequencies for wireless technology. Relying heavily on the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers or IEEE, a group consisting of engineers with no medical or health expertise whatsoever. Let's be very clear on the difference between health-based and industry-based standards. Our current standards are industry-based and are there to allow the continuation and expansion of industry activity. They are based on thermal effects only, ignoring all evidence previously cited in this presentation. They rely on standards derived from the SAR method, which use short-term exposure rates only, whilst ignoring the risk of accumulated dose. The known effects of modulation were also inadequately addressed in the SAR method and must be fully considered for any standards claiming to be health-based. Health-based standards must consider the non-thermal effects and different modulation effects, with long-term exposure rates and the total accumulated dose, that we are going to be subject to in a 5G Internet of Things saturated future. Only then will we have standards that are in service to life rather than profits. The Oceanic Radiofrequency Scientific Advisory Association, a group that is in direct contact with Stop 5G Perth, has the world's largest and most comprehensive database of scientific studies on electromagnetic radiation and health, taken from their website. Quote, ORSA is a non-profit organization of scientists and professionals of various academic disciplines who are interested in the scientific research that investigates the effects of artificial electromagnetic radiation on humans, animals, and the environment. As the name indicates, ORSA has a specific focus on radiofrequency electromagnetic radiation that includes high-frequency microwaves widely used in wireless communication and surveillance technologies. End quote. Now, this group of independent experts did a critique of ARPANSA's TRS-164 report. Their presentation, Radio Frequency Exposure Risk Assessment and Communication Critique of ARPANSA's TRS-164 report, Do We Have a Problem? By Victor Leach and Stephen Weller, can be found on their website at orsa.org. I highly recommend flicking through it, as it contains far more revealing information than could be covered in this presentation. Also concluded that there was, quote, scientific inaccuracy and that the conclusions did not accurately reflect the evidence. Evidence dismissed and ignored in conclusions. Absence of precautionary approach is palpable. And importantly, the Australian public is being misled into believing that TRS-164 is a comprehensive and independent review of ARPANSA's extensive database. Important papers available within the time period have not been considered. End quote. More on the guidelines from emfscientist.org. Quote, numerous recent scientific publications have shown that EMF affects living organisms at levels well below most international and national guidelines. Damage goes well beyond the human race, as there is growing evidence of harmful effects to both plants and animals. End quote. So let's hear what Professor Paul has to say about this. Quote, the existing exposure standards have no scientific basis because they assume the only way electromagnetic fields can exert biological effects is by heating tissue. This contradicts thousands of peer-reviewed studies that have reported biological effects at levels well below existing exposure standards. End quote. Stop 5G Perth is fortunate enough to have Professor Paul's assistance, and he was recently in communications with ARPANSA on our behalf, inquiring into the public health concerns and issues regarding the safety standards. From Professor Paul's 28-page letter, where he directly informed ARPANSA of their critically flawed safety guidelines, with citations to all his supporting evidence. Professor Paul even spelled out how ARPANSA can go about proving otherwise. Quote, we have here, In total, 158 bodies of evidence, each comprised of many primary literature citations, each showing that our panzer is wrong in regard to the causation of a particular biomedical effect. Our panzer can, if it wishes, challenge each of these 158 bodies of evidence, each showing that our panzer is clearly wrong here. It can be seen from these 41 different statements that the panzer position is widely rejected by independent scientists from all over the world. Of course, this is not at all surprising, given the vast amounts of evidence on each of these non-thermal effects." End quote. This was the end of the email exchange, with no response given. The following is a document released by and shared with us by Professor Paul entitled 8 Repeatedly Documented Findings Each Show that EMF Safety Guidelines Do Not Predict Biological Effects and are, therefore, fraudulent. The consequences for both microwave frequency exposures and also 5G. Some incredible information contained within, with knowledge we have not yet heard mentioned anywhere else. Quote, "The electrical parts of millimeter waves are highly absorbed by materials including the materials in our buildings and materials in our bodies. Such absorption means that 5G plans have entailed putting out tens of millions of antennae in close proximity to our homes and other buildings, putting out very high power EMFs, such that the electrical parts can penetrate into our homes and other buildings, such that electrical devices can communicate with 5G antennae. The high absorption argues that these millimeter waves will be particularly active in activating the VGCCs, or voltage-gated calcium channels. That is one very large problem. Very high-level VGCC activation. The second large problem is the high numbers and high power of the so-called small cell antennae, which means that it will be essentially impossible to avoid 5G EMFs, especially when we are outside and have no shielding between our bodies and the antennae. I predict, therefore, that 5G inevitably will create not only human but also ecological disasters of unparalleled proportions. Small mammals, birds, and insects will be heavily impacted because of their large surface to volume ratios. The same thing will be true of plants, where even large trees have their leaves and reproductive organs highly exposed. One of the consequences that I predict is that we will have huge conflagrations because EMFs make plants vastly more flammable. That may make fires much worse than the recent California fires commonplace. I am, therefore, profoundly concerned about both the human effects and the ecological effects." End quote. Professor Martin Paul continues, quote, "One of the claims that the industry makes is that millimeter wave frequencies to be used in most 5G radiation will be absorbed in the outer 1 millimeter of the body, and therefore 5G will have no effects in underlying tissues. Now, we have evidence from the CIA translated documents that millimeter waves act at least 20 times more deeply in the body than industry claims is possible." End quote. These declassified documents are displayed and referenced on screen. Professor Paul continues, quote, "I showed in Chapter 7 of my 90-page document what the industry claims about penetration of microwave effects were false, such that microwaves act at least 40 times more deeply in the body than industry claims is possible. I predict that similar but much more severe effects will be produced by 5G as are produced by microwave frequency EMFs. I also predict, because of the roles of aqueous dissolved ions in producing these deep effects, that regions of the body with large internal bodies of water will be expected to produce particularly severe problems." End quote. Professor Martin Paul then goes on to detail the likelihood of birth defects, the eyes, the kidneys, and the heart, all areas of the body containing large bodies of water, because water absorbs radiation effectively. More on the corruption and collusion of government and industry. From brochure 6 out of 6 from the Competence Initiative for the Protection of Humanity, Environment, and Democracy, called Health Implications of Long-Term Exposure to Electrosmog. Quote, "With the support of willing scientific advisors, those in political power relieve their conscience with the dogma that electrosensitive persons do not exist. What is not said out aloud, however, is that they should not and must not exist because their recognition would interfere with commercial interests." End quote. The Procrustean approach was a thesis written by Don Maish, PhD. It was, quote, "an examination of the manipulation of telecommunication standards by political, military, and industrial vested interests at the expense of public health precaution." End quote. It is interesting that PhD papers have actually been written about these areas of deception. Maish continues, quote, "It will be shown that these processes have been prone to political manipulation and conflicts of interest, leading to various scientific perspectives being marginalized with reluctance of the part of the regulators to make decisions that might inconvenience industry interests." End quote. The International Journal of Oncology published a paper in 2017 entitled World Health Organization, Radiofrequency Radiation and Health, a Hard Nut to Crack, review by the highly respected Lennart Hardell. Quoting from the paper, RF radiation was classified as a Group 2B possible human carcinogen. Further epidemiological, animal, and mechanistic studies have strengthened the association. In spite of this, in most countries, little or nothing has been done to reduce exposure and educate people on the health hazards of RF radiation. On the contrary, ambient levels have increased. In 2014, the WHO launched a draft of a monograph on RF fields and health for public comments. It turned out that 5 of the 6 members of the core group in charge of the draft are affiliated with the International Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection, an industry-loyal NGO, and thus have serious conflicts of interest. This provoked many comments sent to the WHO. However, at a meeting on March 3, 2017, at the WHO Geneva office, it was stated that the WHO has no intention to change the core group. End quote. Everywhere you look, there is industry collusion and conflicts of interest. Emeritus Professor Henry Lai, PhD, has a long research career at the University of Washington, focused on the biological effects of non-ionizing electromagnetic fields from extremely low frequency to radio frequency, and their possible medical applications with research endpoints covering molecular biology, neurochemistry, and behavior. The former co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Electromagnetic Biology and Medicine has published over 100 peer-reviewed research publications, one of which showed how studies are heavily influenced by their funding source. Quote, Dr. Henry Lai examined the results of cell phone studies documenting biological effects and found that results depended on who funded the study. End quote. From the graphic we see on screen, 67% of studies funded by non-industry showed an effect, compared to only 28% when funded by industry. We must understand this mechanism of data and statistical manipulation within the corporate science agenda. Time and time again, our government is using misleading science to justify its actions, and it is important to always understand the source of a study's funding. So what does all of this mean for us practically in our homes and in our communities? Here we have an environmental electromagnetic energy report for a site in Perth, Western Australia, found at rfnsa.com.au. This website can be used to search for Australian mobile network base stations to find electromagnetic energy or EME reports, site locations, carrier contact details for existing sites, and community consultation information for new sites. This particular site is an existing 3G and 4G installation with a proposed 5G upgrade. You can see a map showing the radiating areas around the site, with the current maximum EME level alongside the proposed. This may change depending on the status of a particular base station proposed and existing. Very important, notice how they express the levels in terms of percentage of the public exposure, which we now know to be orders of magnitude higher than most other countries. So scrolling down in the report, we see at a distance of 0 to 50 meters from the base station is 1011 milliwatts per square meter, or 1,011,000 microwatts per square meter as used in earlier charts. This equates to 10% of the public exposure limits, sounding like a very comforting stat for those living in close proximity. However, those listening to this presentation now know better. But what happens when you consider what we now know, that our standards are hundreds, thousands, and even million times higher than other areas in the world? What if instead of 10% of the public exposure limit, it said over 10 times the safety limit in France, or Russia, or Israel? Or 15 times the safe limit in China? 50 times the safe limit in Luxembourg? Or how about 100,000 times the limit in Salzburg, Austria? At an international EMF conference in London 2008, Paolo Ficcia, head of ICNIRP, said about the exposure guidelines, quote, "What they are not mandatory prescriptions for safety. They are not the last word on the issue. and they are not defensive walls for industry or others." End quote. Why then does our government hide behind such standards, as if there is no doubt, no possible room for discussion or change? Other places in the world are taking drastic measures to protect their people, with Brussels becoming the first major city to halt 5G due to health effects. Vaud in Switzerland are adopting a resolution for a moratorium on 5G technology. Multiple Swiss provinces have halted the tech, among reports of other localized areas across the world. So why not here in Australia? In 2011, the EU passed Resolution 1815. Quote, "Take all reasonable measures to reduce exposure to electromagnetic fields, especially to radio frequencies from mobile phones, and particularly the exposure to children and young people who seem to be most at risk from head tumors." The resolution goes on to say, "Reconsider the scientific basis for the present electromagnetic fields exposure standards set by ICNIRP, which have serious limitations and apply as low as reasonably achievable principles, covering both thermal and athermic or biological effects of electromagnetic emissions or radiation." End quote.